Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Cayla Runka and I work at Diabetes Canada on the Knowledge and Connections team, and I'll be your moderator for today. I would like to start by acknowledging that I'm calling in today from Toronto and that I'm located on the traditional Indigenous territory of the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabeg, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and that Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. As a health-focused organization, Diabetes Canada recognizes that there is systemic racism within and throughout our institutions, and that we have the responsibility and the power to create culturally safe and appropriate environments of care. We are here today as part of our new initiative, Open Hours. Diabetes Open Hours is our live call-in show, especially for you to ask any and all questions regarding you or a loved one's lived experience with diabetes. The program runs the last week of every other month with a different topic and guest expert, so be sure to follow us on social or visit the website regularly for updates. And while we do have a medical expert on the call with us today, this session is in no way meant to replace a regular visit with or the information you obtain from your own medical health professional. So today's theme is Know Your Numbers and ABCs, and we're very lucky to have Dr. Harpreet Bajaj here today to answer your questions on blood sugars, ups and downs, hemoglobin A1c, blood pressure, and cholesterol, otherwise known as your ABCs. Dr. Bajaj is an endocrinologist and the medical director of endocrine and metabolic research at LMC Healthcare Centricity Research. He is a research associate at Mount Sinai Hospital, Toronto, and an adjunct lecturer at McMaster University. He is the principal investigator of the Canadian Diabetes Prevention Program, a nationwide collaborative effort between LMC, Diabetes Canada, and the Public Health Agency of Canada. And Dr. Bajaj currently serves Diabetes Canada as the chair of the Clinical Practice Guidelines Steering Committee. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping things. Please note this session will be recorded and may be included as part of our public-facing channels, including our website and YouTube channel. Please know that we will take all measures to protect your privacy and will not be sharing any names or record of the chat or Q&A features. We ask that any comments or reactions you share be affirming and positive, and that you use this time and this feature as an opportunity to further your learning, engagement, and curiosity, and support the same in a respectful way for others. On the Zoom taskbar below, you will notice two buttons, the chat and the Q&A buttons. Simply click the icon and type your question or comment into the space provided. Since guests will be muted, the chat button is an opportunity to communicate with each other and share your thoughts and personal anecdotes and stories. The chat is visible to others on this call, but again, there will be no use of the chat on the video recording of this session. Now, the other button I mentioned is for the Q&A. This will allow you to post your questions throughout the session confidentially directly to our guest expert if you would like your question to remain anonymous. Also, if you choose to unmute at any time to ask a question, that's fine, but please know your voice may appear in the recording of the video, but your name and account image will not. Lastly, the closed caption feature has been activated for this session, so please feel free to use this feature if it will be helpful to you. And with that, are you ready, Dr. Bajaj?
I am, Cayla, and thanks for that introduction. Yes, let's go.
All right, great. So maybe while we're waiting for the first questions to come in, we can chat about some of the basics. So I have only experienced living with diabetes through my relationship with my mom, but I do know there are concerns with highs and lows and maintaining a steady blood sugar level. So maybe we could start by just generally speaking about blood sugar, its role in the body, and what happens for people with diabetes when they're trying to control those levels.
Sure, yeah, let's start with the basics, absolutely. And at various points, I'll try to, give an analogy to how we drive a car, because many among us drive a car, right? So I'll just try to give analogies to that as we speak during this conversation, if that's okay.
Great.
So what does glucose do, or what are the normal levels? Normal as in when we consider glucose not to be a medical problem. Let's discuss that first. Glucose in the body is useful to give us energy And there are various body organs that use glucose. They can also use other sources of fuel other than glucose as well to maintain that energy and body function. So other sources of fuel may be fat, maybe what we call ketone bodies. There may be some other fuel sources that are useful as well in other organs of the body. Now, there is one organ in the body, which is the brain, that only can use glucose as the only fuel. So our brain is totally and completely dependent on glucose to use as a fuel to maintain its function. The other organs like heart and liver and kidneys can use other alternative fuel as well, other than glucose, but not the brain is how it is. And so for that reason, because it's so essential for brain's function, for that reason, our body has many different hormone systems to try and maintain the glucose in a good range, not in a low range, not in a very high range in a normal circumstance. So one of the main hormones in our body that controls this sugar in the normal range is insulin hormone. So insulin is a hormone that is released if the sugars are going up, or if we eat when the sugars are supposed to be going up, the insulin is released from the pancreas to try and bring it down into the normal range. And the opposing hormone to insulin, so a hormone that does opposite the work of insulin to try and maintain that balance, is glucagon. Glucagon is also made in the pancreas, and it kind of, if your sugar is going too low, then the glucagon starts going up so that the sugars are maintained in the normal level. Again, there are other hormone systems as well in the body that maintain the sugars, but it's mostly the insulin and glucagon that counterbalance to try and control the sugars within that range. So then what is the normal level of glucose in people where we think there's not a medical problem? Usually the range is between 4 to 6 in the morning time, in the fasting time, that we think that the sugars are in the normal range. And after meals, we expect a little spike, but that spike up to about 8 millimoles per liter is okay in a normal person. That's what we think is the normal range for glucose levels, if you will. Now, the analogy to the car, if we're driving on a highway, and I'm not recommending that we drive too fast or something, of course, right? But let's think about driving on a highway that has 100 kilometer per hour speed limit. Typically you would not get a ticket, at least, right? If you're driving at 110 or 90 or somewhere around that range, right? So that's the analogy to the car driving on a highway is, we try to maintain that driving speed around the 100. It doesn't have to be exactly the 100. It may vary in between this range, let's say 90 to 110, 115, so that we are within that safe zone, if we will, and we will not get the ticket. How do we do that? By pressing the accelerator or the brake, right? So those are the ways we control that. So that's the analogy to insulin and glucose as well, right? So those are the two hormones that kind of maintain the glucose in that normal range as such as well. So I hope that answers your first question, Cayla.
Yes, for sure. And then I guess one of the questions that came up was, what kind of things affect our blood sugar? So if we're looking at maintaining that sort of steady state, where do we need to pay particular attention?
Yeah, so and that's a great question. Even in people without diabetes, but also especially in people who live with diabetes as well, there are many different things that can affect the sugar. Of course, we know eating does, and we mentioned that it can spike up to 8, even in people without diabetes as well. But there are other circumstances other than eating. For example, exercise, any kind of exercise, even a moderate to a mild exercise level as well can help bring down high sugars to a normal range. Other factors, bodily stress, not sleeping enough or not getting enough sleep can affect blood sugars in an adverse way. So it can raise the sugar as well. Also, just the time of the day as well, because as we are waking up, many of our hormones, like the adrenaline hormone, the cortisol hormone, are trying to ramp up in the morning to try and get us awake and give us the energy boost. And that itself in the morning can raise the sugar a little bit or more in different people as well. So it can vary from person to person. Then illness can also affect the sugar. So illness as in having a fever, having some infection can increase the sugars. Then there are some medications that can also elevate the sugars. Those medications could be steroids, for example, steroid medications that are sometimes prescribed for asthma or other conditions, autoimmune conditions as well, or some other medications that can sometimes increase the sugars as well. So those are, in a nutshell, some of the conditions that can increase the sugars. Normal in a person who does not have diabetes, there's still the insulin and glucagon will try to maintain the sugars within the normal range. But in people with diabetes, of course, these all of these factors, whether it's steroids, whether it's certain kinds of foods or exercise or lack of exercise, can play a major role as well with the sugar control as well. Now, I said that 4 to 6 is the normal sugar for a person without diabetes. For people living with diabetes, the target range is up to 7 for fasting, and then the target range for after meal is up to 10, 2 hours after a meal as well. So 2 hours after a meal, we want the spike to stay in the single digits, not in double digits. So kind of like, again, going back to the car analogy, okay, maybe up to 120 kilometers per hour, most people would not get a ticket, right? I mean, maybe some cop will still give you a ticket, but up to 120, probably you will not get a ticket as well. Don't quote me on that, okay? You get into trouble. So that's the car analogy to that.
Okay, great. And you've mentioned a couple times that blood sugar varies throughout the day. So the next question is, when do you realize something might need to be addressed? How long can your blood sugar be high before you need to start worrying about maybe making some changes with medication or other parts of those things you've mentioned that impact blood sugar?
Yeah, so in people with diabetes is, I guess, what we're talking about this question. And so in people with diabetes, once in a while, if the sugars go up because we had a treat, we indulged a little bit, that's not when we need to start adjusting the medication. Of course, everybody's, allowed to have their birthday cake or whatever other treat that you like. At least the suggestion or request is that we can try to maintain portions, smaller portions of those treats, and maybe even some people can try to compensate for having that treat by reducing other carbs within that meal, if you will. So having less of let's say bread or rice or potatoes, so that it compensates for that piece of cake that you had as well. So then if it's just one-off, we don't need to start increasing or changing medications. However, if it's a consistent daily pattern or most days of the week, then we need to start looking at, hey, after dinner is when the sugar starts spiking more than 10 on most days of the week. Maybe we need to address that. The other lab parameter that helps us in all of this is called the hemoglobin A1c, or the A1c test, as we call it. It's a blood test, so it's not that something that we test at home. And this A1c number, kind of in a easy way, it to understand it, it's basically an average of last 3 months of sugars before that test was done. So if I get a blood test today, and I can do it any time of the day, it doesn't matter if I do it morning or afternoon or night, it kind of averages out what my sugars have been for the last 3 months. So what was my sugar in February, March, and now in April is what it will tell me. And all of the sugars, not just the morning or evening sugars, but all of the sugars over the last 3 months, how they've been. Now, the normal range for this A1c test is less than 6%. So that's for people without diabetes, we say normal is less than 6. If the A1c is between 6 to 6.4, the Diabetes Canada guidelines say it's termed as pre-diabetes. So it's a precursor to diabetes condition that we call as pre-diabetes, which means that there is a high risk that the sugars can worsen into the type 2 diabetes or range from that. And then anything more than 6.4, so if we go to 6.5 or above, is considered type 2 diabetes. So the target, as I said, for after if you're doing the finger prick or other means of testing your glucose at home, we said after meal it should be less than 10. Fasting it should be less than 7 for people with diabetes. For A1c test, the target. So that's the first of the ABCs, Cayla as well. The A of the ABCs is A1c, and the target for most people is less than 7 on that ABCs.
Okay. And then while we're on that A of the ABCs, how frequently should you be getting your A1c tested? And does that vary based on whether you have type 1 or type 2 diabetes?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it needs to be individualized, and you have to look at various factors when you determine how frequently you get it. So maximum, so every 3 months is what the Diabetes Canada guidelines would say. Maximum every 3 months, so maximum 4 times a year is when we should get it. So A1c is an average of 3 months, and so if you get it every 3 months, that makes sense as well. But for some people who might not need to have it every 3 months. You don't need to necessarily go to a lab every 3 months, right? If an individual has diabetes that is very well controlled on the A1c, and they're doing their testing at home, and it is very well controlled, and they are on let's say 1 or 2 blood pressure medications that they've been stable on for many, many months as well. So nothing new is changing, no new medication was added or deleted as well. Then you can do it every 6 months as well. So it can vary a little bit how frequently we should have this blood test. But in most people, every 3 months, but it can be relaxed to up to 6 months if we think somebody has diabetes that is within the target range that we want it to be.
Okay, so yes, very individual. Best to work with your personal healthcare provider on that front. Just before we move to another participant question, we haven't talked about low blood sugar yet. So maybe we could just spend a minute on, what does that look like and what some of those values are, and what people can look out for when they are experiencing a low blood sugar.
Yeah, so it's very important to understand this. So you asked about, Cayla, you asked about the high sugars and when we should address it. I said if it's consistently high is when we address it. But for low blood sugars, even one low blood sugar can be challenging. It can be burdensome. It can lead to symptoms of low sugars, and on the other hand, if we think about high sugars, many people would not have any symptoms. Even some people, if they've had high sugars up to 15 or even 20, sometimes some of individuals may not have any symptoms from high sugars. On the other hand, low sugars can cause a lot of symptoms. So what are these symptoms? The first stage of symptoms is basically warning signs of low sugars. These warning signs could be trembling or shivering. So they could be heartbeat going very fast. So what we call palpitations of the heart, right? So racing of the heartbeat. They can be sweating. They can be just a sense of disorientation or hunger as well. So those are some of the warning signs of low sugar. The second stage, if it goes very low, typically around 2 or less than 2, is when people can have other major problems with low sugar as well. There can possibly, with low sugars, people can have problems with coma, they can have seizures, they can have heart arrhythmias as well. So there can be major problems from low sugars if they go very low. So it's very important to understand the low sugars. Now, however, it's scary, right? Having low sugars sounds very scary with all of what I've just said. Fortunately, we know that which medications in diabetes can, have the possibility of causing low sugars, right? So it's not all of the medications that people might be taking for diabetes that can cause low sugars. So some of the medications that can cause low sugars are, of course, one is insulin. So if somebody is taking insulin to manage their diabetes, it's absolutely necessary to have a good understanding around low sugars and how to deal with them and how to treat the low sugars as well. And then the other class of medications that can have the potential for low sugars is called the sulfonylurea class. So these medications like gliclazide or glyburide or glimepiride are available in Canada. And these medications can also cause low sugars. These medications are used in type 2 diabetes. Insulin can be used in type 1 diabetes, can also be used in type 2 diabetes, of course, insulin. So those are the medications, insulin or sulfonylureas, that can cause low sugars or hypoglycemia.
Okay, so both people living with type 1 and those with type 2 on medications are at risk for low blood sugar.
Yeah, so both people with type 1, absolutely, because they are typically on insulin, which is the hormone that is deficient in people living with type 1 diabetes. And so that is a risk factor. For people with type 2 diabetes, it's the people who are using either insulin or any of these sulfonylurea medications. But these days, we are seeing less and less use of the sulfonylurea medications, and other medications outside of sulfonylurea or insulin do not cause hypoglycemia. And so people living with type 2 diabetes, if they're using other medications, they have a very negligible or zero risk of causing hypoglycemia.
Okay, good to know. We have a participant question wondering if you can explain what time in range is, and if this is a new sort of measure and its importance.
Yeah, so time in range, maybe I'll go back to my analogy on the car driving in this. That 90 to 110 kind of range, right? So is where we want to keep driving at for safety, of course. And so time and range is kind of that safety zone, if you will, for managing blood glucose levels. So what is that? What is the target for that? So there's an international consensus on CGM, so continuous glucose monitoring. Continuous glucose monitoring is not the typical finger prick, but these are sensors that can be put on either the arm or the abdomen or other places in the body that continuously monitor glucoses for 24 hours. So not just a static number when you check your sugars with a finger prick, but these are sensors that stay on the body, just like a toonie. They're small, quite small, and they go on as a patch. And these can monitor the glucose levels, for 24 hours, for 7 days or 2 weeks, depending on the device that you're using. So on these continuous glucose monitoring devices, you can get a time and range percentage as to how much the person living with diabetes or otherwise has their glucose is within the certain range. So this international consensus recommendations suggest using the 4 to 10 millimoles per liter range. So anything less than 4 is considered below the range. Anything above 10 is considered above the range. So anything between the 4 and 10 number is then the time in range, if you will. That's the green zone, right? So that's where ideally the glucose levels should be. Now, in people, especially people who may be using insulin to manage their diabetes, we know that glucoses do fluctuate. And so the consensus, this international consensus recommends that 70% of the time in range be maintained is what the recommendation is. So 70% of the time between 4 to 10 is what the guideline states, and then less than 4% below the range, and then less than 26% above the range of 10 is what the guideline suggests. So that's a green zone, time in range. The target for that, especially in people with diabetes who are injecting insulin to manage their diabetes, the recommended goal or target is 70% in that range.
Okay. And I'm assuming the importance of that is, again, to maintain that sort of stable blood sugar level to prevent some of the side effects in that. And there's actually another participant question similar to that. So they're wondering if they're above normal number on a day-to-day basis, whether it's fasting or post meals. If they're above that range one day, does damage to the body and organs per se happen sort of that day, or is it only when it's elevated over a longer period of time?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And the answer, the response to that, it is over a long period of time. So higher glucose levels over time, over many years, is when the damage starts showing up. Typically about 10 to 15 years from the diagnosis of diabetes, if a person living with diabetes, if their glucoses have been above that range or that target that we discussed, then the complications of diabetes potentially can happen at that time. So it's not just one-off higher sugar that causes bodily harm at that point, but it's typically over many months and years if the glucoses are high.
And just a follow-up question on the time and range. Someone is wondering whether someone who is using a glucometer and doesn't have access to a CGM device can also assess time and range with the glucometer.
Yeah, so before the CGM devices became available, we had this, people were doing many different things. They would, one of the methods was to check glucose levels 7 times in one day. We don't typically ask for that. It's a very onerous, it's very time consuming, and also a lot of finger pricks for that. But that's one other way of checking what the time and range is. So 7 times would include, before and after a meal, 3 times a day. as well as at middle of the night, so midnight kind of a blood glucose test as well. So that can be another way to find, what somebody's glucose fluctuations are, and if the glucose fluctuations are within that green zone that we discussed or not. Typically, we don't do that, typically maybe we'll ask to alternate glucose testing if somebody does not have access to CGM. Unfortunately, access is a limitation. Access and costs are big limitations in the CGM use. Then depending on what medications are being used, their healthcare provider may discuss whether alternate testing, as in test glucose fasting one day, another day after breakfast, another day after lunch, to get kind of a sense of where the glucoses lie, may be a less onerous and less expensive, as well as less painful way of glucose testing as well.
Right, I can imagine, yes. There's a couple more questions, and then maybe we'll move on to the B part of ABCs, since we haven't discussed those components yet. So one question is around type 2 specifically, and whether there's a natural progression once you're diagnosed as you age, even if it's managed well. Is there always sort of that progression of the disease as you get older?
Yeah, so that's a good question. In our medical school or other graduate school, that's typically the definition that we've learned for type 2 diabetes. That type 2 diabetes is a chronic condition. Chronic means permanent condition, and a progressive condition. Progressive as in it worsens over time. And some studies, like landmark study from UK called the UKPDS, suggests that the pancreas, which makes insulin, the ability of the pancreas to make insulin after a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes reduces over time by about 6% per year. So about 6% less ability of the pancreas over a year by year. Then you can imagine, if 6% times whatever, it can lead to 50%, 60% decline over 10 to 15 years, right? So that's kind of been there, and that's how most of us learned about type 2 diabetes. Now, more recently, there has been some suggestions, some studies suggesting that it's not all a downhill slope, if you will. There is a possibility that some of this downhill progression can be reduced, at least, so that slope of reduction, slope of worsening of the pancreas to ability to make insulin can be reduced. One way that has been suggested is weight loss. Weight loss, either it is with various dietary modifications or exercise, or with bariatric surgery. There is a lot of literature from the bariatric surgery, which is a surgical operation. It's also called the gastric bypass surgery, right? Bariatric surgery. So with this, there have been some studies suggesting that the pancreas' ability to make insulin does not deteriorate as much over time as well.
Okay. Speaking of dietary, one of the questions is, can diabetes be controlled by diet exclusively? So I'm assuming that answer may differ between type 1 and type 2.
Yeah, and thanks for pointing that out. Of course, Cayla. So type 1 diabetes, where the pancreas has a minimum or zero production of insulin. Of course, insulin is the treatment that individual will need. and it should not be withheld, and it should be started as soon as possible and maintained throughout life. It's life-sustaining for people with type 1 diabetes, and that's very important to understand the difference between type 1 and type 2. For people with type 2 diabetes, initially, early on, within the first few years of type 2 diabetes, and later on as well, diet plays a big role. Dietary interventions play a big role in terms of maintaining glucose within those targets that we discussed. Of course, individual situations and social situations, individual barriers, challenges play a role in all of what is possible for an individual. But in Diabetes Canada guidelines, we do suggest, right from diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, a comprehensive management. So medications plus minus, or I should say diet plus lifestyle or health behavior modifications plus or minus medications is what is recommended as a comprehensive management of glucose control. And then monitoring after that. So monitoring for the glucose checks at home, as well as that A1c test that we discussed as well. So that can guide whether an individual, their glucoses can be maintained within that target that we discussed as well, with solely with diet, or do medications need to be added or increased over time as well. So for some individuals, yes, and especially initially, diet can be very, very helpful, and not necessarily need a medication, at least in the initial few years of diagnosis of type 2 diabetes.
All right, we have one more question on the A's, and then we're going to move on to B. The question is, if your hemoglobin A1c is under control and is staying quite level and within those range numbers that were provided, is it recommended to get a continuous glucose monitor, or are you able to just continue on the way that you've been doing things?
Yeah, so it's more of a cost and access question, and it'll have to depend on that. There's these monitors, unfortunately, are quite expensive. Also, if you look at data, how much difference does it make? In terms of whether we are talking about difference, if somebody's using these continuous meters versus what we typically do with a finger prick, does it make a difference on A1c? There are various studies that have been done on these comparisons. They suggest that for some people, it may make a difference on the A1c. So for people who use insulin to control their type 2 diabetes or type 1 diabetes, these continuous meters may be a useful tool. For some individuals with type 2 diabetes who are on at least 2 or 3 oral drugs that they're using for their type 2 diabetes, it may also be useful to help A1c get better. At least one or two studies that have been done suggest that. But it's not just the A1c control, it's also about reducing the risk of low sugars or hypoglycemia as well. So I think the question that you asked is about if somebody's A1c is already within the target, let's say less than 7, let's say their glucose, their A1c is 6.8, then what's the role of these continuous glucose monitors? So in people with type 1 diabetes or people with type 2 who may be using insulin, there may still be a role to monitor as well as alarm about low blood sugars as well, because many of these sensors have built-in alarms around a glucose of less than 3.9 or so, and so that can be very useful so as to prevent catastrophic low blood sugar as well. So it depends on the individual situation, but in some cases, especially in type 1, to reduce the risk of hypoglycemia and to monitor and manage hypoglycemia risk, continuous glucose monitors may be useful even if the A1C is less than 7.
Great. Okay. So the B part of ABCs, blood pressure. I'm going to kick it off with just the question around, do people living with diabetes have a higher risk of experiencing issues with their blood pressure?
Yeah, so people with type 2 diabetes, there is a definite kind of association with higher sugars and higher blood pressure. Blood pressure also varies from individual to individual. There are many different individual things that change blood pressure. Of course, age is one of them. As we grow older, our blood pressures do rise. Of course, salt plays some role in blood pressure also in a person without having a high blood pressure problem, or in people with high blood pressure problems as well. Salt can play a role. In terms of blood pressure, individual variations are there, but in people with type 2 diabetes, there is a higher chance of having a problem with high blood pressure.
Okay, and then a sort of a two-part question from one of the participants. So if you are at risk for higher blood pressure because of living with diabetes, but you also have a hereditary genetic component in your family of high blood pressure, can lifestyle interventions be effective? And then if so, I guess, what might some of those things be, or will you inevitably probably require medication?
Yeah, so much like glucose, blood pressure as well, the first line of therapy for high blood pressure in many individuals, unless the blood pressure is very high above the targets, then initially health behavior changes. So whether it is dietary control or weight reduction or salt reduction, or I should mention alcohol reduction as well. So those can be helpful in terms of reducing the blood pressure. However, if the blood pressure is more than 20 millimeter mercury more than the target, in most people, we think that these health behavior modifications may not be enough by themselves. And so blood pressure medication would be recommended right from the word go in those individuals as such. So in most people, if the blood pressure is about 10 millimeter mercury more than the target range, initially health behavior changes can be suggested, and then monitoring is what we need to do, monitoring at home as well as maybe at your healthcare provider visits as well, to see if that's making a change or not, and when medications may be necessary.
Okay, and then just so we're clear, the normal range for blood pressure would be what?
Yes. So in people with diabetes, let's talk about ABCs of diabetes, Cayla. In people with diabetes, the target range, which is recommended, is 130 for the higher number, the systolic blood pressure, and then 80 for the lower number, or the diastolic blood pressure. So that's the target that is recommended for people living with type 1 or type 2 diabetes.
Okay, and so you had said that 10 millimoles above that would be oftentimes lifestyle interventions, but 20 or more is when potentially medications would come into play.
Yeah, initially, and if lifestyle modifications or health behavior changes are not working, then we start medications even for 10 above the target. Yeah.
Okay. So let's move on to C. The C part is cholesterol. And, I know even with my sort of healthcare background, when I get my blood work done, I find it very confusing, the breakdown of the blood lipid levels that I see on my paperwork. So maybe we could start with just a general idea of what those values are and their importance, and then we can get to some of the targets with respect to diabetes.
Sure, yeah. And Cayla, we should mention that these blood pressure and cholesterol targets are important to reduce the risk of heart problems, so heart attacks or strokes, or what we call peripheral artery disease, which is basically less circulation or problem with circulation in the feet, the blood circulation in the feet as well. And so that's where the blood pressure and cholesterol targets play a major role. So that's why it's like ABC. It's not just it's not just glucose control in people with diabetes, but a multi-pronged strategy to control all these three levels as such. So the different cholesterols that we see on a lab report, the most important one, and probably the only one that we should look at because we don't necessarily change the others, and research shows that looking at other levels is confusing and it doesn't change anything anyway. So the one cholesterol that we should be looking at is the LDL cholesterol, or what is called the lousy cholesterol, right? So L for lousy, right? So that's a good way to remember which cholesterol we're talking about. So LDL is the bad cholesterol, as it's called. Bad as in that's what causes the blockages to happen in the heart arteries or in the arteries that supply blood to our brain or to the feet in circulation as well, right? So that LDL cholesterol, the target for people with diabetes is less than 2 millimoles per liter is the target for most people, that's recommended to be maintained to reduce the risk of having heart attacks, strokes, or having circulation problems in the feet. Now, I should mention that beyond just looking at a target LDL, in the guidelines, in the guidelines for Diabetes Canada, as well as the guidelines that come from our sister organization, the Canadian Cardiovascular Society, which makes lipid guidelines or cholesterol guidelines as well, right? The recommendation is even if some people may have their LDL cholesterol within that less than 2 millimoles per liter, they're still recommended a medication, most commonly a statin type medication, to reduce the risk of having or reduce the, for prevention of a heart attack or a stroke. And the reason for that is, big studies have been done that even if the LDL is less than 2, for example, in people with type 2 diabetes, there was a big study, even if the cholesterol was less than 2, giving or starting a medication like a statin would actually reduce the risk of having a heart attack by about 50%. And so for that heart protection is when a statin recommendation is there. It's kind of like going back to my analogy on cars, right? It's kind of like no matter what speed you're driving at, right? If you're driving low or high or whatever, you should always wear a seatbelt, right? So that seatbelt is your statin, if you will. So people with diabetes, no matter where the glucose is, no matter what the blood pressure LDL is, if you're above 40 years of age, as one of the recommendation, right? So if you're above 40 years of age, and if the individual is living with diabetes, then a statin medication is recommended regardless.
Great. We're coming to the end of our time. I just want to let everyone online know that I've put a little summary tool about the A, B, C, D, E, and S's of diabetes care into the chat. And before we wrap it up, I just want to know, Dr. Bajaj, do you have any sort of parting words for people in terms of these tests and targets that we've been talking about?
Yeah, let's. We've talked a lot about medical terminology and maybe even I hope helped understand some of these terminologies and why they matter and what the targets are. On a nutshell, on a big picture level, I think the bottom line is that we know a lot more about living with type 2 or type 1 diabetes. So living with diabetes, we know a lot more from research as well as experiences than we did ever before. And so, maybe 20, 30 years ago, people would think of having a diagnosis of diabetes and then be concerned whether their lifespan is going to be affected, whether they're going to get complications, what their future is going to hold. But now, over the last 30 years, with the innovation in technology, with more research having been done, we can be actually quite confident that people with diabetes, whether type 1 or type 2, we have the right tools and strategies to help try and have similar quality of life with minimizing complications of diabetes, as well as some of that lifespan issues. So whether people with diabetes have a smaller lifespan is also been clarified in many of the research studies, which suggests that people with diabetes can live as long as people without diabetes as well. Right? So with these tools and technology and innovation in medicine, I think that is the case. So I want to end on that positive note.
Yes, thank you. What a wonderful way to end. And I know I learned a lot, so I hope the participants did as well. And everyone, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us. It's not easy. We're busier than ever, but the benefits are always worth it. After the session, I'll follow up with an email with an evaluation and some additional resources on the topics that we covered today. And with that, a very, very big thank you to our guest expert today, Dr. Bajaj. I sure hope our participants enjoyed it as much as I did. And without the generosity of your time and expertise, our open hours would not be possible. So very much appreciate the time and effort you spent with us today.
It's my pleasure, Cayla, and stay healthy, stay safe.
Yeah, great.
Thank you.
To learn more and stay up to date on Diabetes Canada's work and resources, you can visit our website at diabetes.ca or check out our social media channels. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. You can also feel free to call our info team at 1-800-BANTING, that's BANTING, or email info@diabetes.ca with any questions. Make sure you stay close for our next episode, which will be in June, and feature another guest expert speaking on fitness for everybody. So stay tuned for that. And we hope the webinar was helpful for you and look forward to hearing some feedback from you in the next little while. So thank you again, Dr. Bajaj.
Thank you.
Bye.